Hi, my name is Nikhil Shrikhande, and I'm with the Network Load Balancing team, and I'm going to talk a little about our plans for Whistler and what we plan to do for the next release of Windows. So first of all, what lessons did we learn from Windows 2000? I'd like to spend some time talking about it. What feedback have we received from customers like you, and what we plan to do to address some of the concerns that you have told us that you have. I will then talk about some of the most important features and get into some specifics. And finally, there'll be some time for question and answers. And you'll have an opportunity to send feedback to the product team, which we would like to incorporate into Whistler. So what have we learned from Windows 2000? First of all, several of our customers have told us that network load balancing is quick and easy to install and configure, especially for small and medium-sized clusters. We've also been told that for larger-sized clusters with 32 nodes, or for instance, are generally harder to configure and manage and control. We've also been told that network load balancing offers a lot of flexibility. So users are able to add and remove hosts from the cluster while maintaining overall stability of the cluster, and while the cluster still continues to handle incoming traffic. The other advantage that customers say NLB has over most of our competitors is that NLB does not require any specialized hardware. So you can run you can host more than one website, for instance, on the same set of machines, and so you can leverage your existing infrastructure with minimal impact on the existing network and the machines that you've already made an investment in. So what were the areas that we were asked to improve upon? Like I mentioned before, we were told that network load balancing is difficult to use when you have to configure large clusters. And while we are completely aware of that, and personally I find it hard to configure a network load balancing cluster of more than 25 or 30 nodes. Microsoft is coming out with a product later this year called Application Center, or App Center. This product will allow users to configure NLB clusters of any size. In addition to this, it also has several other features, like it will allow you to replicate data across several hosts. And I would encourage you to take a closer look at this new product. It's really very useful. The other concern that several customers had was to do with switch flooding. Now, as many of you might know, the way NLB works is that all incoming packets, which are meant for the cluster, need to be seen by every host in the cluster. In order for that to work, the switch sends out all incoming packets to every port, and that way every host in the cluster sees those packets. Now, the obvious problem with that is that if you have non-NLB machines connected to the switch, then those machines would also end up seeing traffic that is meant for the cluster. And this is a nuisance and an unnecessary overhead, and sometimes can result in a bandwidth hog. So we have a new feature for Whistler called IGMP support, which I will talk about later, which will prevent or limit switch flooding only to those ports which have NLB machines connected to them. We've also been told by customers that network load balancing is unable to monitor application failures. I was given a scenario by a customer about 2 weeks ago at a conference where he said that they had an application which they load balanced across several hosts. If that application, or an instance of that application, were to die on one of the hosts, NLB would still continue to accept traffic on that machine, even though the application which was being load balanced no longer existed on that machine. And the reason we tend to do that is this. NLB is a driver that sits in between the TCP/IP layer and the NIC driver layer. So it's really hard for NLB to know what an application is. NLB knows what an IP packet is because it does IP load balancing, but it barely knows what a TCP connection is, and it really doesn't know what an application is. So if an application were to die, then NLB is not aware of it. The way to address this problem is to have an application layer program that monitors these applications for failure, and if a failure occurs, then it it alters NLB status and maybe prevent NLB from accepting any traffic that is meant for the application. And the product that I talked about a few minutes ago called Application Center does exactly this. It will monitor the application for you, and if the application were to die, then it could, if you want, prevent NLB on that host to accept any more traffic meant for the application. And again, this product is due out later this year. And a final concern that several of our customers have suggested, and personally, when I've used NLB, also had the same issue, was that today users have to add the same IP address in two places. So when you configure NLB, users have to add the cluster or the virtual IP address first in the NLB UI and then in the TCP/IP UI. This is clearly a nuisance, and we agree. It can lead to misconfiguration very easily because users might add an IP address to NLB but not add it to TCP/IP. And a question that I get asked several times is, why do I even have to enter the same IP address twice? And that's the question we are trying and attempting to address in Whistler. While saying that, I want to point out and be clear that we are in the very early stages of the design for the UI, and we would really love to hear from you in terms of and get feedback from you in terms of what you feel we should do in order to make the UI easier to use so you wouldn't have to enter the same IP address in two places and have the potential of misconfiguration. So what are the goals for Whistler? We had three major goals. The first goal was to make NLB easy to use, and this is an ongoing goal. This goal is a goal for Whistler. It will be a goal for Blackcomb, which is the next release after Whistler, and it will be an ongoing goal as long as we ship Windows. We have to make all our products easy to use. So what are we doing to make NLB easy to use in Whistler? We are thinking about, and we're in the very early stages of the thinking process, we're thinking about integrating the NLB UI with the TCP/IP UI. This would mean that users would have to enter the cluster IP address only once in the NLB UI, in the TCP/IP UI, and then go to the NLB UI and choose from a drop-down list, choose one of the existing IP addresses, and configure and use that IP address as the cluster IP address. This will prevent misconfiguration because now you would have to enter the IP address in only one location. Then we want to do something to control the switch flooding issue. The way to control it is to use IGMP for group membership. Excuse me. And this way, the cluster traffic gets limited to only those ports on a switch which have NLB machines connected to them. And in the next slide, I will explain, or in the subsequent slides, I'll explain how this works. The other feature that we wanted to add based on the feedback that we received from customers like you was that today you can have multiple clusters running on the same set of machines, but they all have to run on the same network card. The disadvantage of doing that is that on a single network card, you can configure NLB in only one way. So even if you have multiple clusters running on the same set of machines, all those clusters will have the same port rules, for instance. Also, if you're running or hosting multiple websites on the same set of machines, you might want to have the different websites accepting traffic off of different network cards, just so that at the network level, you have the traffic going on independent routes. And so in Whistler, you'll be able to enable NLB on multiple NICs. So you could have multiple clusters running on the same NIC, or you could have multiple clusters running on multiple NICs. And each of the clusters configured on different NICs can be configured in their own way, with their own rules, with their own affinities. So let's take a look at what the UI might look like in Whistler. Due to lack of space, I just wanted to make sure that I got the two most important windows on the slide. The first one shows all the components in a local area network connection properties page. Excuse me. So in Whistler, to find network load balancing, the user would have to go inside the TCP/IP properties page. And this seems like the most logical place for NLB UI to reside. And the reason for that is NLB does IP-based load balancing, and so it should logically reside in the TCP/IP UI. In the TCP/IP UI, there will be an obvious way to get to the NLB UI. But first, the user would enter the virtual IP address, the cluster IP address, in the TCP/IP UI, and then move on to the network load balancing properties. Then there would be a drop-down box in the primary IP address space, and the user will be able to choose from an existing IP address. Today, users can add an IP address in NLB that does not exist in TCP/IP, leading to misconfiguration. We're hoping that in Whistler, we would do away with this, that users would have to choose from an existing IP address, thus avoiding any misconfiguration of this kind. And again, I want to restate that we are in the very early phases of designing this, and we would love to hear feedback from all of you and your thoughts, and we would love to incorporate those in this particular feature. So let's talk about how switch flooding can be controlled. Today, if you have a switch and if you have 8 machines connected to the switch, once you get an incoming request which is meant for the cluster, let's say an HTTP GET request, this request is sent out on every node on the switch. This would mean that non-NLB machines will also see the traffic that is meant for NLB machines, and this is clearly a nuisance. So what we do to overcome this problem is that the NLB host in the cluster would send out an IGMP group membership request to the switch. This request will enable the switch to learn the multicast MAC address of the NLB cluster. Now bear in mind that for this feature to work, the cluster would have to be configured in multicast mode. Once the switch learns the multicast MAC address of each of the NLB machines, then on receiving an incoming request, which is meant for the NLB cluster, it would only send out that request on those ports which have the multicast MAC address. And this way, all incoming packets meant for the cluster will only go on those nodes which have NLB machines connected to them. And this way, non-NLB machines will not see the incoming cluster traffic. And we see this as a big boost for NLB deployment. I think we have a few questions. So the question is, in order to make the best use of NLB, job profiling needs to be included in the system. What are you doing to address this? Now, if I understand the question right, job profiling would probably mean finding out how a user, for instance, browses and goes to what websites, and based on that, make a decision on how to do network load balancing. The other way I would interpret this question, and I would love to see more on this question. The other way to interpret this is would we do load balancing based on, say, CPU load or incoming connections? We currently do not have any concrete plans of doing this in Whistler, but we are very, very actively looking at having such features in the Blackcomb timeframe, which is a release after Whistler. Another question. With the addition of SAN in the NLB equation, it is extremely necessary for sharing data among the nodes. What is being done to address this requirement? In a previous slide, I mentioned a new product coming out later this year from Microsoft called Application Center. While allowing users to configure network load balancing from a single point, Application Center also allows you to replicate data across the various nodes of a cluster. And so if you use App Center, you would be able to achieve what you've stated in the question. So let's move on to the next slide. Multiple NIC support. What this means is, like I mentioned before, is you can host independent clusters on the same set of hardware, on the same set of machines, and at the same time have different port rules and different configuration for each of those clusters. So if you look at the slide, you have 3 clusters in the slide. Cluster 1 has 4 machines. 2 of those machines might have just one network card with NLB configured and enabled on it, because they're just part of one cluster. Another machine might have two network cards with NLB configured on both those network cards, and it could be part of two independent clusters, cluster 1 and cluster 2. Cluster 1 and cluster 2, in this case, could have completely different configurations, different affinities. One could be in unicast mode, the other could be in multicast mode, and they could have completely different port rules. But you end up using the same set of machines. Similarly, you could have a third machine, which is a part of three clusters. You could have three network cards. NLB would be enabled on all three of these, and each of those clusters could have different rules. So a great example of using such a scheme is to have the same set of machines host two clusters, a front-end cluster and a back-end cluster. And that was one of the biggest motivation behind adding this feature into Whistler. And those are all the new features, and I would be open to any more questions that you might have. So we have one last question, I believe, or two more. Replication of data is a waste of storage, I agree, and requires additional support. What is MS doing to include a DLM or such? The best way in order to not have to replicate data across several hosts is to have a two-tier cluster. The previous talk, which was given by Mark Wood, talked about Microsoft Clustering Service or server clusters, where you could have a back-end database. You could have a back-end cluster which connects to a single database and a front-end NLB cluster which accepts incoming connections. If that doesn't answer the question, please feel free to send me email at nikhils@microsoft.com. That's NIKHILS, and I would be more than happy to answer this question in further detail. I have a question that says, where's, oh no, it's not a question. Well, if you have any more questions, feel free to send me email. Once again, my address is nikhils, NIKHILS, @microsoft.com. And I really look forward to hearing from you, and I promise you that your feedback is really important for us, and we'll use it in every way we can in order to make NLB a great product, not just for Whistler, but for subsequent releases as well. Thank you for your time.